This video is sponsored by Classic Football Shirts, the best place to get your classic and vintage football shirts. To get cheap retro Palace shirts, click the link in the description below. And for an extra 10% off, use the code CFSPJ10 at checkout. Hello and welcome to the Crystal Palace podcast. I'm Alfonso Greenbrook, and in today's podcast, I'll be looking over the game against Huddersfield by bringing you my match review, player rankings and my man of the match. As well as this, I'm also going to bring you interviews with Roy Hodgson, Wilfried Zaha and Jordan Ayew after the game. So let's begin. Yellow proved to be lucky for Crystal Palace once again, as Wilfried Zaha's superb first half strike sealed their second victory of the Premier League campaign at the expense of Huddersfield Town. The Eagles debuted their new third kit at the John Smith Stadium, stirring flashbacks of other fine victories on their travels from yesteryear clad in the colour, and while the majority of the game may not live long in the memory, Zaha's goal certainly will. He added another addition to his ever-increasing highlight reel of Palace strikes in the 37th minute, which ultimately sealed the contest. But it took a dogged display from Roy Hodgson's team to seal a first 3 points haul since the opening day, despite finding their goal under siege at times. Despite being winners in their previous 9 games, the hosts were lively in the opening 15 minutes and nearly found a way in front when Aaron Moy switched the play out to Chris Lowe, allowing the left back to cross, and Steve Mounier met the delivery but rippled the top of the net with his header. But the free-flowing action soon gave way to a slugfest, as some heavy challenges by both teams saw James McArthur, Matthias Jorgensen and Zaha all go into Lee Mason's book, rifling up an already boisterous home crowd who heaped pressure on the official at every attempt. However, a deteriorating encounter was lit up on 38 minutes with a piece of brilliance by Zaha. Terriers supporters' boos were ringing in his ears when he picked at the ball from Jordan Ayew 40 yards from goal, but he then embarked on a fine run down the left that saw him tease past Florence Heidegger, squeeze into the box between the left back and Ellis Kajunja, and despite a tight angle whip the ball past keeper Lawson to silence the natives. Fired up, Zaha almost grabbed a second when he raced onto a ball over the top to create a silent goal for himself, but this time Lawson was able to smother his low attempt. But Zaha's brilliance gave Hodgson's team the lead at the break. Having been a spectator for virtually the whole of the first half, Wayne Hennessy suddenly became the busier of the two goalkeepers, as Huddersfield built up a head of steam in the 15 minutes after the restart. He used his gloves for the first time moments after kick-off when an offside Kajunja headed goalwards. And then Huddersfield had the ball in the net when Philip Banning lashed home following a corner. However, Mason had rightly whistled for a foul on Mamadou Sakho. Billing then attempted to find the score sheet in successive games, but fired rashly over from the edge of the area. And then the woodwork was struck when Moy connected sweetly with a volley from 20 yards, which clattered off the base of the upright, stayed in play and was recycled for Hadjiani to strike goalwards from close range, which Hennessy managed to push away. Incidents continued to come thick and fast, but having weathered the storm, Palace found themselves the more dangerous, and Cheku Kouyaté nearly marked his first league start with a goal when he bundled the ball into the net following a corner, but it was ruled out for a foul on Lawson in the build-up, which looked to be a soft decision. Then with 20 minutes remaining, a swift counter-attack saw Zaha slip in McArthur, but the Scotsman fired his first-time shot over after a lung-blasting 80-yard sprint, but as the seconds slipped by, David Wagner's team piled on the pressure but simply couldn't hit the target. With seconds remaining, there was one more scary moment for the hordes of travelling fans to endure when Moy scuffed the volley clear to Billing, who thumped the shot goalwards, saw it clatter off McArthur and dropped towards the target, but thankfully it zipped wide of the post to ensure that the Eagles claimed their third straight win over Huddersfield for the first time in their history. It was an important win for Crystal Palace as they won 1-0 away to Huddersfield Town on Saturday. Wilfried Zaha once again was the man to make the difference, with Palace's star man scoring the only goal of the game at the John Smith Stadium. But what did we pick out from the game? Here are some of the moments. Zaha's celebration. We've seen it before and Wilfried Zaha was at it again as he cupped his ears to the Huddersfield Town fans. He'd been getting stick from home supporters for much of the first half, after his reaction to a couple of fouls and his own challenge on Hadjiani. But he silenced the crowd in the best way possible with his goal, before recreating the gesture he gave to the Watford fans last season at Selhurst Park. Wan-Bissaka almost injuring Townsend. The pair worked closely together to keep Huddersfield quiet down the left-hand side, but perhaps too closely at times. Indeed, Townsend was nearly injured by his teammate towards the end of the first half, having to receive treatment after being caught by Wan-Bissaka. Tomkins' calmness. When Van La Parra lomped the ball across the face of goal just before the break, it could have caused panic inside the Palace box. But Tomkins was coolness personified as he coolly got between Steve Mounier and the goal to allow Wayne Hennessy to claim the ball. A new fan's favourite. He was only making his second start for Crystal Palace, but Cheku Kouyaté is already becoming a popular man among the Eagles supporters. The travelling support sang his name after a solid display in midfield, and the Senegalese midfielder did his bit to integrate himself with the fans by going over at the end of the game to give his shirt away, allowing one supporter to be the first to get their hands on the new yellow third kit. It was a nice gesture from the 28-year-old. So now I'm going to move on to the player ratings, but before I start, don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Crystal Palace for all the latest Palace news. And also, if you're on Facebook, do feel free to join our Facebook group, which is a really great place to join in with discussions and also share your opinions with other fans. And much like a forum, it is a great place for you not only to read other people's opinion, but also to post your own opinion on there. So if you are someone like myself who likes to get involved, likes to be, kept up to date with all the latest Palace news, then of course you can follow both our Twitter and Facebook pages. And if you are also like me and you do like to get involved and you like to have discussions with other fans, as well as just sharing any sort of interesting news articles you may have found, then of course do feel free to join the Facebook group where you can obviously upload stuff there. And of course, if you want a place to connect with other Palace fans, then of course you can do so on there as well. Now, another great place to share your opinion is in the YouTube comments. So if you are listening to the podcast on YouTube, then obviously feel free to drop a comment below the video with your player ratings where you rate the players' performances from 1 to 10. Now, even if you are not a Palace fan, you're a Huddersfield fan and you don't want to do player ratings, then just comment below with your overall views of the game, because I'm going to talk about it in quite a lot of detail in a minute. But personally for me, looking back at the game, quite simply, Huddersfield were by far the better side, but obviously it took one sort of moment of magic for Palace to win the game. So you can look at the game in two ways, in the fact that a win's a win and the performances don't matter, or you can look at it and go, actually we were quite lucky considering how good Huddersfield were throughout the game. So if you do want to comment your player rating so I can compare it to my own, of course feel free to do that. And even if you don't want to do that, or you're a Huddersfield fan, then of course sort of just comment with your overall views of the game. And that's basically so that obviously I can come back and see what the listeners thought about the game, but also any other people who come to the video, whether they be new Palace fans or Huddersfield fans, they can not only listen to my views in the podcast, but they can also read the comment section and just sort of have an oversight of what other fans generally thought about the game. But like I've said already, if you do want to follow any of these social media pages that I've mentioned, and obviously that includes the Facebook group, then do check all links that will be in the description below. But we're going to move on now to the player ratings, and we're going to start in goal with Wayne Hennessy. Now personally for me, considering how good he's been recently, and the fact that during the international break he was pretty decent for Wales as well, you could go look at this game and actually say he's come into this game with quite a lot of good form, and arguably you could say the best form he's ever been in. Now this game was sort of slightly, I suppose, because it was an average performance from the whole team, it was a slightly less performance from Hennessy, and I do think, reflecting back on that, I do think a 6 is a fair reflection of that game overall. Now obviously I talked about already the fact that Huddersfield probably threatened Palace for the majority of the game and were by far, I'm not denying it, Huddersfield were by far the better side. And actually because of that, I thought Wayne Hennessy, obviously considering you're the last sort of man that Huddersfield had to try and get by, he was obviously put under quite a lot of pressure, and you can understand that. The fact that Huddersfield were playing better than us, you can understand them having quite a few opportunities for own goal. Now obviously this was on more than one occasion, especially in that sort of first half where Palace were very sort of lethargic up until the goal and very sort of lacklustre. Up until that point especially, I think, Hennessy, there was a few little mistakes there, a little bit shaky at times. But what you've got to look at it is, a player can have a sort of very average game. I like to use Zaha as an example. Zaha may have an absolutely average game, but then pulls one bit of brilliance out and helps Palace to win the game or get back into games. And Hennessy had this sort of game here where he wasn't necessarily great, but when called upon, when he had to make that save, when he had to make himself big, and obviously when he had to sort of show some brilliance to keep Palace in the game, that's exactly what he did. So the reason I've given him a 6 is the fact that he was fairly average throughout the game, but he did there were a few moments where he made important saves, which of course, considering the amount of pressure Huddersfield were putting on us, that's obviously great to see as well. Now the one thing I didn't like about his performance, and considering how good he's been this season, it's quite concerning, is the fact that he didn't necessarily look that comfortable, because last few weeks, you know, especially during that international game, he looked very comfortable. Whenever the balls were coming into the box, he was claiming them. Whenever, you know, he was one-on-one with players inside the box, or whether there was just loads of players in the box and he sort of had to get his positioning right, whatever it was in aspects to the goalkeeping situation, he was doing that fantastically well. Whereas here against Huddersfield, whether it's just because the whole team weren't playing that good, whatever it was, he didn't necessarily look that comfortable. And of course, I think it was Aaron Moy where he hit a strike from about 20 yards out. Obviously, we were quite lucky that it went off the post. But just looking back at that, a few weeks ago, I think Hennessy would have either dived for that, or he at least would have sort of shuffled his feet over to, I believe it was his left-hand side. Obviously, it hit his left post. But of course, Hennessy stayed quite static, sort of didn't even move. So maybe that's sort of one thing to criticise him on, in the fact that if that had gone in, it would have looked like he made no attempt for it. But the fact that it went off the post, you know, we can't really dwell too much on that. But, you know, I think overall, yes, he was a bit shaky here and there, but obviously he made these important saves, and that's what you want from any player on the field, let alone your goalkeeper. You want a player who, if they are going to have an average game, they're still going to do their job, or they're going to do a moment of brilliance or make a good save when it does matter. And that's exactly what happened with Hennessy here. Now, in terms of just going back to the Aaron Moy shot, yes, you could say that Hennessy should have done better. Obviously, it didn't end in a goal. Obviously, the fact that he stayed quite static isn't great, but then you could look back and go, actually, maybe the defenders or the defensive midfielders should have either cleared or blocked that shot beforehand. So you can look at it two ways, and I'm not really going to sort of berate Hennessy too much for that, but it's just a thing to pick up from his performances, because as I said against Southampton, as I've said in the games before that this season, he's been very good this season, and arguably probably, you know, top 3 players for Palace this season. But obviously, maybe he just had a slight off game here, and certainly I do think he does warrant the 6 I've given him. So we're now going to move on now to the defence, and I'm going to start with the right back, Aaron Wan-Bissaka. Now, once again, this guy's been absolutely outstanding. You know, he's a great talent for Palace, and once again, he put in another solid performance, and I'm going to give him a 7 overall. Now, much like Hennessy, in the fact that it was quite an average performance, you could argue that with Wan-Bissaka, in the fact that he made a few errors here and there. But the thing that I like about him is just sort of his tenacity. So when he does make an error, he'll try and sort of make up for it by getting back and actually trying to get the ball back off the opposition player, or sort of just got that tenacity just to keep up with the player. And even if he can't make a tackle, which we know he's all good at, even if he can't do that, he still gets there and makes it difficult for that player to get across into the box or just to create an opportunity. So that was the thing that for me, even though it was a pretty average performance, you know, nothing outstanding from him, I do think the fact that he was able to make up from these little errors and mistakes obviously just shows how much character and, you know, how much of a good quality player we've got here on our hands. And obviously we know how good he's been recently, in the fact that he makes these sliding challenges, and obviously he's very, very good at winning the ball back from opposition wingers or fullbacks, and that's exactly what he done here. You know, much like with Hennessy, in the fact that he was pretty average but still had good moments here and there, that's exactly the same with Aaron here, in the fact that playing at right back, obviously you're got a lot of pressure, considering Huddersfield were playing better than us. Lots of pressure from their sort of wide players, and I think Wan-Bissaka done a very good job in terms of challenging them. And obviously, quite a few times his slide tackles, as usual, were very well timed. Now, once again, like I said already, just to go back onto that sort of the point I made about tackles. Obviously, it was another good showing from him overall, in terms of he kept a clean sheet, so that's obviously great for any defender. But also the fact that he made several tackles as well, and most of them, or some of them, came from the errors he made. But like I've already mentioned, the fact that he made up from them errors sort of brushes them aside and doesn't really need us to highlight them too much. Now, obviously, like I've said already, it's obviously not great when you make errors, and maybe you could argue because he's a young player, maybe them errors just sort of show his little bit of inexperience. And even if that is the case, you're going to eventually get experience. And the fact that if you could say he looks inexperienced now when he's playing so well, what is he going to look like when he's got experience? He's going to be a hell of a player if, you know, once he gets that sort of full sort of Premier League team experience. But like I've said already, you know, the fact that his inexperience showed is obviously not great, the fact that a few of these errors have been made. But like I've said, you know, the fact that he's got that quick recovery and he's got such a good slide tackle, that obviously means that he can make up for it very quick. And that was something that we saw with Papa Soare when he first came to the club. You know, He was very fast down that left-hand side, and obviously once he settled into the team, he was a real asset for us. And you could argue that's the same with Wan-Bissaka, in the fact that once he got into the role, obviously he used to be a winger, but once he's got into that right-back role, and now the fact that he can combine his pace with that slide tackling ability, as well as getting forward as well, the fact that he's able to now combine everything just shows that he's slowly developing into an even more better player. But like I've said, few moments here in the game, his inexperience did show with the few errors, but like I've said, the fact that he made up for it is the main reason I've given him a 7, because any player who doesn't necessarily have the best game but still has moments of brilliance, that's obviously good in my eyes. So overall, a 7 for Wan-Bissaka. I think that's a fair result. So we're going to move on now to the centre-back, James Tomkins, and once again, you know, a clean sheet, a pretty defensive, sort of solid defensive performance overall from the team. So I'm going to give him a 7 overall. Now, the main point to talk about Tomkins is the fact that how much we missed him, you know, 2 weekends ago against Southampton. And, you know, obviously I said that Martin Kelly is a good enough replacement. You know, no discredit to Martin Kelly, because when he has come in and when he's played alongside Tomkins or Sacco, he's been relatively solid for the whole time, but I just think against Southampton he wasn't quite up to it, so obviously it was a relief to see James Tomkins come back into the side. Now, I'm going to talk about this later on in the podcast, you know, in terms of the man of the match. So I'm sort of giving you a glimpse there as who's going to be on it. But James Tomkins, the fact that we played so much, we didn't obviously play great, but the fact that we managed to get a result as soon as he comes back into the side just really highlights for me how much of an important player he is. Now, people talk about Wilfried Zaha, the fact that we don't win without him, we're a one-man team. But actually, yes, that's sort of true, but then you've got to look at it the other way as well and actually go, James Tomkins was also missing against Southampton, and he's as much a key player as Zaha is in attack as to Palace are in defence. So you could argue actually James Tomkins is as an important or even a more important player than Zaha, in the fact that if you're not solid at the back, you're not going to be able to win games, let alone, you know, get some points on the board. So obviously that, once again, that just goes to highlight how much of an important player Tomkins is, in the fact that as soon as he came back we obviously got a result, albeit not sort of the greatest game of football, but nevertheless a result is a result. 3 points is 3 points, and obviously that's great. Now, I do want to say before people sort of comment about it, obviously we know Wilfried Zaha is an absolutely fantastic player, but I've just got to put it out there that actually James Tomkins, he may not be, you know, one of the world's best centre backs, but he's a quality centre back, quality Premier League quality centre back, and you've got to look at it and go, arguably he's as important as Wilfried Zaha. Obviously you could argue Zaha's the better player, but in terms of how Palace play our setup and how solid we are at the back, you know, considering how good we were back end of last season, beginning of this season, you've got to look at it and go, actually Tomkins is one of the key players for that. But the main reason I've given him a 7 is just because I thought he was very calm and very sort of cool at the back with his defensive performance. The fact that he just came back from injury, didn't really look like he's been missing, he just slotted back in there, and the fact that he was very calm, very collective, in the fact that he just kept his defending simple, you know, was able to make these challenges, tackles, blocks, as well as sort of not necessarily doing that great in the air, but the fact that he was still able to do relatively well in the air, considering obviously that physicality, I think it's Mounier especially, the physicality that Huddersfield have got up top. Obviously you can expect it to be a bit of a challenge, and ultimately he was, but obviously we came out the better end of it, even though we didn't perform and play that well. The fact that we got the clean sheet, as well as a pretty solid performance from a player coming back from injury, that's of course great to see as well. But obviously, just to sort of finish off, you know, the main reason I've given him a 7, and this is something that I've repeated quite a lot, because I really do think that Tomkins is an integral part to the team. But obviously it was just great to have him back, not only as in the fact that he's got that sort of defensive solidity, but also sort of just that leadership at the back, and just sort of that calmness and experience he brings to the side as well. Now, it's not just, sometimes, you know, you could think that bringing players back from injury, that's just about bringing in the quality, but actually you've got to look at the experience and just sort of the calmness as well that the players can have in the game. That's as important as the quality that the players do bring. And like I've said already, his performance, albeit not the greatest, because obviously Huddersfield were the better team, but his performance just really showed how much we missed him, in the fact that you could look at this performance here and actually look at it and go, yes, we ground out a 1-0 win, but imagine if we'd had Tomkins at the back and had Zaha play against Southampton, maybe it would have been a different result there. But overall, James Tomkins coming back from injury, a fairly solid performance from him and fully deserving of the 7. So now I'm going to move on, obviously, to his centre-back partner, and that is Mamadou Sakho. And I'm also going to give him a 7 because, much like Tomkins' performance, it is very similar, other than the bit about coming back from injury. If you look at their performances, they were both sort of calm, collective, cool on the ball. And like I've said, we weren't great, and obviously Huddersfield were by far the better team, but I still thought, you know, Sakho and Tomkins done competent jobs at the back. And you know, in terms of comparing Tomkins and Sakho's performances, I suppose you could just say that they were both quite a steady presence at the back, and I suppose that's what you want from a centre-back pairing. Obviously you could have two quality centre-backs, but if they don't really gel together or they don't really work well together, it's not really going to be that great. But the fact that we've got Tomkins and Sakho, obviously quality defenders on their own, but the fact that as a partnership they're very cool, they're very steady as well, and the fact that they've just got that presence at the back too, even though when we're not playing great, still managed to grind out, you know, a clean sheet, that's obviously great to see as well. But the main thing I liked about Sakho's performance, and the main reason I've given him a 7, is just the fact that he made a number of good interceptions throughout the game. Now, that's something we've come to expect from Mamadou Sakho, but ultimately, there wasn't too much to say about his game, because I just thought it was a steady performance from him. You know, he'd done everything you would expect from a centre-back, but just the fact that he made quite a number of good interceptions is the main reason I've given him a 7, because you could argue, given Huddersfield's dominance, if they had a few more chances, or you know, the likes of Sakho didn't make these interceptions, then maybe Huddersfield could have found a way back into the game, or even could have gone on to win the game, considering the dominance and the amount of chances they had. So once again, like I've said already, a very good, you know, a very good win for Palace, in the fact that we managed to grind out that win, that 1-0 win, and the fact that we got another clean sheet is obviously great as well. And you know, you look back last season, it was very rare that we got clean sheets until sort of the end of the season, whereas this season, 5 games in, we've already got 2 clean sheets. So that just goes to show, considering both of the back four was the same as that other game, it just goes to show that once you've got a solid back four partnership and the goalkeeper's pretty solid as well, just goes to show how that can help you build, because the attack is as important as the midfield and the defence, because if you can't defend, you're going to concede loads of goals, there's no chance you're going to win games, and of course if you haven't got a good attack, you're not going to score goals. So the fact that we've got a solid base in both the defence and the attack is obviously going to bode well for us this season. But once again, obviously Sakho and Tomkins, a very good partnership at the back, and obviously Sakho making a number of good interceptions, as well as just being steady throughout the whole game. I do think he does deserve the 7 I've given him. So I'm now going to move on to the final player of our back four, and that is of course the left back, Patrick Van Aanholt. Now, much what was the sort of the theme I've already discussed with quite a lot of players already today, in the fact that it was quite an average performance from Palace, and the fact that Huddersfield were by far the better team. Obviously that, for me personally, did reflect in Van Aanholt's performance, and certainly I do think a 6 is a fair reflection of his game. Now, much like what I said with Mamadou Sakho, and the fact that it was a very steady performance from him, it was relatively the same from Van Aanholt, in the fact that he wasn't necessarily brilliant for parts of the game, and he wasn't necessarily terrible for parts of the game. It was a very steady performance, very average throughout the whole game, and sometimes that's what you want from a few players. You know, you want players who can just put in a solid shift for the full 90 minutes, and of course that's exactly what we got from the left back. Now obviously, because Huddersfield were playing so well, it didn't really give him that opportunity to go forward as much as he would have liked, and of course that seemed to sort of restrict Palace in terms of our attacking opportunities, and it was obviously left as people like Ayew, Zaha and Townsend sort of to run the channels and obviously create our attacking chances. Now of course I've already mentioned this quite a lot this season already, in the fact that first game of the season Van Aanholt was absolutely fantastic, you know, on the overlap, proving to be a very valuable sort of attacking asset. Obviously that was great, but obviously the last sort of few games he hasn't necessarily been as effective going forward. He's been pretty solid defensively. You know, I don't really think he was at blame for any of the goals we conceded in the last sort of 3 or 4 games or so, but actually going forward, compared, you know, against the Fulham game, it's gone down drastically, and he hasn't necessarily been able to get forward as much as he would have liked. Now whether that's because the opposition are sort of playing, you know, they're sort of making sure that there's players to mark him now, which obviously doesn't give him the option to overlap, or whether it's just the fact that because the team isn't necessarily playing great, especially in the last sort of 3 games or so, maybe that's just meant that he's just had to sort of defend more and just concentrate a little bit more on the defending, and that obviously hasn't really given him that chance to go forward. But overall I do think average is the best word to describe his performance, because when he did go forward, obviously I said he didn't go forward as much as he liked, but on the very, very few chances he did get to go forward, he sort of made the wrong decisions, whether that be with a pass or a cross. So overall, it would have just been better for him not to go forward, because when he did go forward on them little few opportunities, he didn't really have that much impact there. But overall, I think I talked about this quite a lot, you know, in the Southampton review 2 weeks ago. But this is just a slightly sort of disappointing performance, because the end of last season he set very high standards for Van Aanholt. You know, the fact that he scored 3 consecutive goals, in the last 3 games of the season. So obviously coming into the new season, especially after pre-season and that Fulham game, there were a lot of high expectations considering how good he was in them games in terms of both his defensive and offensive play. But in the last sort of 5 games or so, including the game at the weekend against Huddersfield, he wasn't necessarily quite good going forward. But once again, I want to sort of just highlight the fact that even though he isn't going forward, we're still creating chances, so we're not necessarily losing out too much. And of course, he's still doing his bit defensively, and certainly was quite important to us keeping the clean sheet. So you've got to bear that in mind and think that overall it was a fairly good performance. And certainly, I think that we could obviously improve 10 times by him, attacking further forward. But the fact that we're already creating chances going forward is great. But it just would have been nice for him to get back into the rhythm, starting to go forward a lot more and go on the overlap, because especially with the likes of Ayew now playing up top with Zaha and Townsend, just adding that little bit more pace from left back can obviously just help us to boost our chances going forward. And certainly I do think against Huddersfield, considering we were sort of under the cosh, let's say, for the majority of the game, I do think if he had more chances going forward, we may have seen not necessarily a different result in the game, but we may have seen more sort of attacking opportunities for Palace and sort of just to counter sort of that dominance from Huddersfield. But overall, I do think a 6 is a fair reflection of his performance. So now I'm going to move on to the midfield, and I'm going to start with the captain, Luka Milivojevic. And like what I've said with quite a few players already, it was a relatively average performance from him, and I do think he deserves the 6 I've given him. Now, obviously I talked about quite a lot this season actually, not just 2 weeks ago against Southampton, but Luka Milivojevic, since he's come back from the World Cup, hasn't necessarily been the same player. Other than that Fulham game, he hasn't necessarily been performing to the high standards he set at the end of last season. Now, whether that's a thing that he's still a little bit fatigued from the World Cup and he's still sort of, because he's had a later pre-season, whether he's still getting back to fitness, or whether it's just the fact that he's going through a bad sort of run of form, whatever it is, he obviously hasn't been playing as good as he has been in recent weeks, or he did last season in the last few weeks. But actually this game here against Huddersfield at the weekend was a drastic improvement on the last few week games. Now of course I've given him a 6, so it wasn't necessarily the greatest performance, but the fact that he looked better can only be a positive thing, and hopefully in the next few games, considering we've now got the momentum of a win, hopefully the fact that he's looked better, he can look even more better against Huddersfield, against Newcastle next weekend, and hopefully that can just sort of help him to bring back his form. But just looking at his performance overall against Huddersfield, forget about how he's been in the last few weeks and the fact that this performance was an improvement. Looking at the game away from that, I think he looked very comfortable in the middle of the park, and whether that's because he's just got his confidence back, like I've already said, he's played a lot better than he did in the last sort of 4 games, whether it was that, or whether it's just the fact that he was playing alongside Chiarte a lot and McArthur as well. Maybe it's just because he had that little bit more sort of extra support in the midfield and a little bit more sort of extra skill, let's say. Whether it was that or just the fact that his overall performance improved, whatever it was quite good to see that how much he improved in the game. Now of course, in terms of his dynamism and the fact that he can make that killer tackle or make that killer pass like he did against Brighton, we didn't quite see that in this game. And obviously you can understand that if a player's only just sort of improving on his performances in the last few weeks, you're not going to expect him to come all guns blazing and put in a sort of 9 out of 10 performance straight away. But the fact that he still improved on his recent weeks' performances, that's obviously a sign that he's going in the right direction. And hopefully, considering we've got Newcastle in next week, hopefully he can use that game as an opportunity to, basically, because he's the captain, he's got to lead the team out and hopefully help us to get a result. Because certainly the fact that he improved in this game and put in a fairly sort of comfortable performance in midfield, if he can just up that a little bit more and just continue improving and getting back to where he finished last season, then of course once again he'll be a key player for us going forward. Now one of the reasons he may not necessarily have been able to improve a lot in the game is because in the second half he did look like he was carrying an injury sort of towards the end of the game. Sort of he got it at the beginning of the second half. And I think that was just, 2 players going into a challenge, nothing really too much in it, but I think he may have hurt his elbow. So maybe you could argue that maybe he wasn't playing that great in the first half, in that second half. Maybe that's just because he was carrying that little bit of a knock. Didn't look nothing too serious, but obviously we don't know. But obviously that's just something to bear in mind, in the fact that maybe because for half the game he was sort of carrying a little niggly injury, maybe that sort of didn't allow him to necessarily push on, given the fact that he had already started the game better than sort of he has done in the last few weeks or so. But overall, a very good captain's performance from him, and something I haven't mentioned already, but the fact that for every decision, whether that was tackles against Wilf or just tackles against anyone in the Palace team, Obviously, as the captain, it's your job to go to the referee, but every time that happened, he was straight in the ref's face, trying to sort of not only obviously organise the team, but trying to get his message over to the referee, get his message across. So not only was he putting in a relatively good performance, that was an improvement on previous weeks, but also he was doing something which I said he didn't necessarily do against Southampton, in the fact that every tackle, every little niggly thing, he was going complaining to the referee, and that's obviously what you want to see from your captain, and especially the treatment that Wilfried Zaha was getting in the game. It's obviously good to see your captain sticking up for your star man and just trying to obviously get a bit of protection for the players from the referee. But overall, a good captain's performance from him. Obviously not as great as his performances have been at the end of last season, but obviously it was a step in the right direction, and hopefully in the next few weeks, given the fact that he can come back even stronger after a relatively good performance here, hopefully there'll be better performances to come. So I'm now going to move on to his midfield partner, or one of the three midfielders, and obviously that is Cheikhou Kouyaté. And once again, I thought he had a fairly sort of average performance, nothing too spectacular, nothing too rubbish, and obviously I do think personally, for me, a 6 is a fair reflection of his game. Now of course, Philip Billing, I talked about him quite a lot in the match report. He was obviously one of Huddersfield's biggest threats throughout the game, and certainly was one of their sort of architects in terms of creating chances for the Huddersfield attack. Now obviously you could argue that Kouyaté was quite lucky not to be booked for an early foul on him, but like I've said, in the fact that Luca had to keep going to the referee complaining about challenges on Palace players, you can understand actually that if the referee's not going to give fouls, he's not going to give free kicks or cards for fouls against our players, you can understand he's not going to necessarily do it. Albeit maybe you could argue it should have been a yellow card, he's not necessarily going to do that against Huddersfield players as well. So you've got to look at it both ways and go, yes, he was sort of lucky not to get booked for that, but then considering the fact the referee didn't give Zaha any protection and didn't really book any plays for the amount of challenges he had. Obviously Zaha got players who tackled Zaha got a few yellow cards, but you could argue that maybe a few more should have had, and you could argue that if they had got yellow cards, then maybe Kouyaté should have got one as well. But in terms of what I liked about his game, I talked about Luca's improved performance, and the thing that I liked about Kouyaté's performance is that I said 2 weeks ago that he needed to come into the side, because when he came off the bench he brought energy, he changed the game, and obviously starting the game you obviously can't necessarily make an impact and because you're not coming off the bench, but the fact that he started the game, I thought he added that still in the midfield which we've been missing in the last few games. Now I said with the 4-4-2 that although it works sometimes, the fact that we've lost someone like Loftus-Cheek, it doesn't necessarily work as well as it used to, and I do think, and I said this 2 weeks ago, a 4-3-3 or a 4-2-3-1 would be the best formation to go with, and that's what Roy Hodgson did, because obviously Benteke went out injured, brought in Ayew, played as a lone striker, and Zaha on the left with Townsend on the right, and that obviously change of formation meant that we had a more compact midfield with Kouyaté, Luca and McArthur, and that seemed to really benefit our game. Now although we weren't great in the game, the fact that we had a little bit more control and we weren't getting completely overrun in midfield was obviously great to see, and I do think Kouyaté, in the fact that he added a bit more stamina to the team, a bit more skill in that midfield, that was of course great to see as well. Now the phrase I like to use, and I've used this quite a lot when I'm talking to people about the game, it's just the saying that he ran the midfield, the fact that he constantly was running. And if you look back at the stats, I think other than Luca, I think Kouyaté and Ayew ran the most of any players in the game, and that just goes to show how much Kouyaté ran the midfield, in the fact that he was not only doing his defensive work but going forward as well, he was contributing, and like I've said already, he brought us that physical presence which meant that we weren't getting overrun in the midfield. So and that's basically what we were missing, and that's what we asked for, that's what we got given, and it did seem to help us improve in the fact that we weren't constantly getting overrun. Now obviously I talked about it already, but against Southampton we were getting overrun quite a lot in the midfield, and basically Kouyaté alongside Luca and McArthur playing in that midfield three. Obviously when you play with three midfielders as opposed to two, it's automatically going to give you more control, but the fact that we had someone like Kouyaté who's a very sort of dynamic, athletic player, when you bring him into the side it just gives us a bit more solidity in that midfield. And like I've said already, Huddersfield are a very physical side, not just their attackers but their midfielders as well. So the fact that Kouyaté came in just gave us that sort of needed physicality just to sort of compete against Huddersfield, and certainly I do think he done that quite effectively. So you've got to look at it both ways and go, yes, obviously the three-man midfield did help, but actually bringing in someone like Kouyaté with the energy he has, with that sort of tenacity and that physicality as well, that seemed to improve our game as well. But overall I do think he had a pretty good performance, and in terms of our midfield free plays you could argue that he was one of the better ones. and arguably other people may say maybe you should give him a 7 for his performance, but I do think, looking back at the game on reflection, I do think a 6 is a fair result for Kouyaté. So now I'm going to move on to our final player of our midfield three, and that is of course James McArthur, who I am going to give a 5. Now before I go on to talk about his performance, obviously because I'm recording the podcast on the Monday night, obviously I've heard the news that James McArthur has signed a new deal, and I believe it's till the end of the 2020-21 season, so of course it's great to see that a player like McArthur, who's been very consistent for Palace over the last few years, it's obviously great to see him committing his future to the club. And even though we've got the likes of Max Meyer and Kouyaté now who are putting in good performances in midfield, and ultimately if some fans had their way, McArthur would be on the bench and wouldn't be near the starting 11. But put that aside, I do think he's a very good player, and whether he does continue to play for us this season when we eventually sort of introduce and sort of integrate Meyer into the starting 11, whether he does stay in the starting 11 or not, the fact that he's signed a new contract, keeping him here for another 3 years, that is of course great news for Palace, because obviously not only is he a very good sort of overall sort of defensive midfield player, and the fact that he can continue running, he can make challenges, make tackles, blocks, everything you would expect from a defensive midfielder, but also he's got that threat going forward, and he's very much a box-to-box midfielder. So the fact that we've got someone like this who's in his prime, playing his best football that he has done in his career, it's of course great to see someone like him commit his future to the club. But just to go on now, move back to the game against Huddersfield at the weekend, I've given him a 5 because I don't think his performance was as good as it has been in previous weeks. Now, considering I've said that he's one of the most consistent players that Palace have, and obviously that's an important reason why it's great that he stayed, but in this game here, it was a slightly off game from him. You know, he didn't necessarily play as well as he usually did, and I personally think it's purely because he didn't necessarily have the best start to the game, and that's because he was booked early on. Because I think if he hadn't have been booked early on, he would have been a little bit more tenacious, let's say, in some of his challenges, and he would have been able to make more challenges. But because the fact that he was a bit slow to start the game and made that silly challenge, it meant that he sort of had to be cautious not to get sent off, and because of that, maybe it sort of restricted him in the fact that he weren't able to sort of get involved as much as he would have liked in the midfield. Now, of course, because he was obviously carded, he was walking on a tightrope for the rest of the game. Obviously, the fact that he committed a foul a few moments later, later on in the game, that's obviously quite worrying. You know, he could have been sent off in the first half. But I think reasonably for me, looking back at the game, I think he done a reasonable job in the fact that he knew he was on a yellow card. So rather than just sort of sticking to his normal game plan and just maybe putting in a silly challenge without sort of knowing it, he just sort of got a little bit less more involved in the game just to make sure he could stay on the pitch. But personally for me, I do think he should have come off at half time, not only because Huddersfield were playing so much better than us and I thought someone like Meyer could just make a sort of a bigger influence in the game, but I also just wanted to make sure he wouldn't get sent off. But you've got to give credit to him that although he didn't have the best performance, he still managed to control himself, and even though he was walking on that sort of tightrope, he was still able not to get his second booking, which of course is obviously it's not great to see any players get booked, but when you get booked so early on in the game, the fact that you were able to control yourself and just make sure you don't do anything silly for the rest of the game is obviously great as well. Now, like I've said already, the early booking did seem to affect him, and that's the main reason I've given him a 5. But there is another reason, and that's because he had a really great chance. I think it was just before half time. And obviously just to put Palace, get the second goal, put us 2-0 ahead at half-time. And ultimately that could have sort of changed the whole complexion of the game. But like I've said already, maybe because he's trying to be he's basically trying to be too careful in the game, that not only is it affecting the fact that he can't make challenges because he has to be careful not to get booked, but also when he gets a chance on goal, maybe he was just still in that mindset. And ultimately he should have done better with that chance. But maybe he wasn't quite in the right mindset and obviously missed that good chance for Palace just before, score that second just before half time. But overall for me, obviously the news about McArthur signing a new contract is great. But obviously looking back at the game, not necessarily the best game considering the high standards he sets. But I'm sure that he's one of these players who can pick himself up and put in a good performance. But there are going to be question marks raised over whether maybe someone like Meyer is going to start sort of pushing to get into the side. Because I certainly think not only the competition is going to help both McArthur and Meyer and Kouyaté, the whole of our midfield, really, not only that competition is going to help them, but also it's just going to help our overall sort of squad depth in the fact that we've got options all over the field. But once again, James McArthur, 5 for him, booked quite early on in the game, which seemed to affect his overall overall play. Had a really good chance just before the break, which he obviously missed. And overall, I do think that sort of early booking did really sort of affect his gameplay. But I do think overall, looking at his performance, I do think a 5 is a fair reflection. So I'm going to move on now to the first player in our front three, and of course that is Wilfried Zaha. Now when you consider, you've obviously probably all seen it already, on repeat. And I personally have seen the goal about 20 times already. But Wilfried Zaha scoring a goal of that quality, he's got to be up there with one of our top rated players. But actually, considering it was a quite down performance, considering Huddersfield were much better than us, even though if you took the goal aside, you're probably going to give him a 6. But for the quality of that goal, I'm going to give Zaha a 7 overall. Now, much like what I said with Tomkins, and the fact that when you lose such an important player, when they come back into the side and make such a drastic impact, whether that be scoring a goal or keeping a clean sheet in Tomkins' case, whatever it is, that once again just goes to show and epitomise how important that player is to the side. Now, of course, Zaha, he obviously scored the goal, which is obviously very important for us. But obviously the fact that he just sort of gave us that boost and that sort of creativity up front as well, that was of course a boost for Palace as well. So you've got to look at it, not only the fact that he's the guy who's going to score most of our goals, but actually he's also one of our biggest sort of creative attacking threats. Now, of course, every opponent we've played this season, they seem to boo Zaha, and sometimes it seems to affect him and he doesn't play as good as he usually does, but most of the time he relishes it and basically goes to prove the home crowd wrong and punish them. And basically that's what he done here, and because the crowd were booing him, there were loads of players, Huddersfield players, putting in poor sort of challenges and fouls on him early on in the game. And of course he took out his frustration eventually on Florent. I don't want to try and butcher his surname, but he challenged him, and ultimately Zaha got booked for that. But as you've heard by Robbie Savage said, if people keep kicking you constantly and keep pulling you back and keep pushing you to the ground, eventually you're going to get to a point where you're going to get so fed up that you're going to kick someone else. So although it isn't great that Zaha's taking his frustration out, the fact that he was being booed, the fact that he was constantly being tackled and fouled, you've got to look at it and go, actually maybe it is fair, because it wasn't necessarily a terrible challenge. Obviously it was worthy of a yellow card, but you've got to look at it and go, you can understand why he was frustrated and why he did do that. And obviously, like I've said already, he did deservedly take up the booking for that poor challenge. But certainly there were another few challenges which ultimately could have ended in serious injury. So you've got to look at both sides of the story and go, actually, if you're not going to book some players for horrendous challenges, why are you going to book Zaha for that one? But personally for me, I do think he did deserve to bring up that booking. And obviously, unless you've been sleeping under a rock, you've obviously heard Wilfried Zaha's comments about the fact that he's being picked on by teams and they just constantly keep tackling him. Go and listen to that interview, because it's a very honest thing. And personally for me, I have to agree with him, because teams set out and they target him, they challenge him, and the point that Zaha made is the fact that it will have to take him to break his leg by an opposition player for them to get sent off, or for them to get a booking for a challenge on him. And that just goes to show that actually the fact that a player's coming out in an interview, and the fact that Palace, I think, have appealed to the Premier League about this lack of protection from referees for Zaha, it just goes to show how bad it is. Now, of course, you'd say as a Palace fan, you're biased, you love Zaha, you're not going to say anything bad about him. But I wouldn't wish any injury, I wouldn't wish any bad challenge on any player whatsoever. So, if you've got players who are constantly attacking certain players from other teams and putting in these bad challenges, which ultimately, eventually, is going to end in a serious injury, obviously that's not really a great thing. But moving aside from that, and if you do want to watch that Zaha interview, I would highly recommend you do go and do so, because it's very honest, and it does sort of highlight what most fans think, in the fact that if you keep getting challenged like that, it's obviously unacceptable that it's not being dealt with by the referees, and of course you can understand why you're getting frustrated. But moving alongside from that, and obviously moving back to the game against Huddersfield, I've mentioned already the fact that he was getting booed for from the home support throughout the game, and ultimately, like Zaha does in classic fashion, especially like he did against Watford, he just silenced them by scoring an absolutely superbly taken goal, and obviously that broke the deadlock just before half time. Obviously, admittedly, Huddersfield were by far the better team and probably should have been ahead, but the fact that we got our chance, one of our limited chances, the fact that we took it just goes to show that this is what we've been lacking this season, in the fact that we had loads of chances, we didn't finish them off and we got punished, whereas the same's happened to Huddersfield here, where they didn't take their chances but we took our one limited chance and we just punished them. And once again, it just goes to show, like the Southampton game last weekend, where we didn't take our chances yet Southampton did, that was exactly the same here but the opposite for us. And the fact that we were able to get that one chance was obviously great to see as well. But once again, that goal, obviously I could talk about it for ages, but the fact that he picked up the ball from 40 yards, ran best part of 30 yards, dribbles past one defender, past another, rifles it away from the goalkeeper into that sort of top right hand corner. Absolutely fantastic, you know, taken goal. And of course I could sit here and talk about it for hours, but if you want to, I'm not going to dwell too much on it, because if you want to watch it, go and watch it, because it's an absolutely class goal. But like I said already, it just goes to show how much ability he's got. The fact that even though we're playing pretty poorly in this game, pretty average, the fact that he can still pop up with that moment of magic just goes to show how much of an important player he is. Now, I've said this already, I've said this last season, I've said it I think the season before, and you know, I'm going to say it again here, but it just goes to show the quality of Zaha, that even when him himself and the whole team is having a pretty average game, the fact that he can still pull out that moment of magic just goes to show how good of a player he is. And you could look at that and go, actually, people like Hazard, for example, even when Chelsea aren't playing that well, Hazard still performs, and that just goes to show how much of a quality player he is. Now, I'm not comparing Zaha and Hazard for quality, but I'm just saying in terms of how important they are to their sides, in the fact that they perform well and perform moments of magic even when the team isn't performing well. That's something that you've got to look at and go, actually, Zaha is as important to Palace as maybe Hazard is to Chelsea. But like I said already, he wasn't great, and he wasn't obviously the greatest in terms of the amount of chances he had, but we would have lost without him. Ultimately, yes, he didn't necessarily play that well in the game, but it just takes one chance. If you finish that one chance, you can win a game. And even though, like I said already, Huddersfield were by far the better team, if you have one chance, you take it, you ultimately deserve to win the game, because unlike the opposition, you obviously took your chance, and that's exactly what we did. But overall, Zaha, yes, he got booed, and obviously he was getting tackled throughout the whole game, so obviously he was a bit frustrated, but I do think he dealt with that quite well, and obviously done it in the best way possible by scoring that absolutely fantastic goal. A few games already this season, actually, that goal's got to be up there already as one of the goals of the season. You've got to look at this one and go, actually, the fact that he ran 40 yards, past 3 defenders, then put it top corner, that's got to be up there with one of the goals of the season contenders. But here we go, Wilfried Zaha, a 7 for him, a good performance from him. And obviously, if you do get a chance to watch that interview with him, do feel free to comment below or get in contact with us on Twitter and just share your sort of overall views of the treatment of Wilfried Zaha, as well as the interview he did give. So we're going to move on now to the right hand side. Obviously going to go on to the right winger, and that is of course Andros Townsend. Now, like I said with a few players, it was a slightly disappointing performance from him, pretty average. I do think a 5 is a fair reflection on that. Now obviously I said it was quite a poor game, but I still think he did work hard, and that's something you can always expect from Townsend. He very rarely puts in a 5 out of 10 performances. You know, he's a very consistent player, normally puts in 6s almost every week. And although it was slightly disappointing here, you know, playing on that right hand side, I still thought he worked hard for the team, and that just goes to show that actually, much like someone like Fernando, or even someone like Hennessy, if you're not going to play good, at least just sort of put in a consistent, steady performance for the team, and that's exactly what Townsend did. Now, in terms of an attacking sense, he didn't necessarily create too much with Palace, but I mainly think the reason for that is because Huddersfield were playing so well. Not great, I must say. Huddersfield weren't playing great, but the fact that they were playing better obviously restricted our chances going forward. But I do personally think, looking back at the game, looking back at highlights, I do think our sort of attack was sort of centred around Ayew and Zaha. So ultimately, if you've got a front three and you're sort of mainly focusing on 2 players or even 1 player, obviously players are going to miss out. And ultimately for us, even though Townsend did try and get involved and worked hard, he didn't really create too much in an attacking sense for Palace. Now, personally for me, there's not really too much to add from that, and that's the reason I've given him a 5, is the fact that he was fairly quiet in this game, didn't really do as much as we would have liked to see from him from the game. But I do think a 5 is a fair reflection of his performance, considering the fact that he worked really, really hard down that right hand side. But Andros Townsend here, playing on that right hand side, a 5 for him. So we're going to move on now to our final player, and that is of course the new signing, Jordan Ayew. Obviously against Southampton 2 weeks ago, he started that game there, obviously his first start for the club, and of course he started here against Huddersfield alongside Zaha and Townsend, as I've already mentioned, and I do think he had a pretty decent performance overall, and I do think a 7 is a fair reflection of that. Now of course, given the injury to Christian Benteke, he was obviously given the nod up front, and I actually think we did need a change up front. You know, people were saying Sola should start, and I was sort of debating that. But I think it was just time for a change, get rid of that target man in the side, and just play sort of a more dynamic, fast-paced striker, and that's exactly what Ayew does. Ayew can obviously play alongside the the front three, but in this game here he was playing as our sole striker, and although he didn't necessarily offer that much in terms of goal threat, so in terms of getting in the box, creating chances, having shots on goal, even though he didn't do too much in terms of goal threat, I still thought he worked hard in the fact that he was running down the channels, creating space for the likes of Zaha, and the fact that he combined really well with Zaha and Townsend. That obviously is a really impressive thing for me. Now, obviously, we know Benteke hasn't really been playing that well this season, and of course, Alexander Sorof, some people may think he's not good enough, but personally for me, I don't think he's been given a proper chance yet, albeit he may prove not to be good enough quality. But the fact that Jordan Ayew comes into the side and really complements that front three really well, and the fact that he fits into that 4-3-3 system so well, just goes to show that actually he should be our starting striker. But also it does sort of highlight the fact that we need to carry on with this formation, because just from one game alone, and obviously a few sort of appearances when players have come off the bench and we've changed our formation, them alone, plus with the fact that we started with this formation here, just goes to show that actually with the players we've got, especially with Ayew, with his pace and with his energy, alongside our already sort of fast-paced let's say front three with Townsend and Zaha, with that alongside Ayew, that does seem to be working really well. And like I've said this quite a lot, I definitely know for last season, but I'm sure in seasons gone by, I've said that it's very important that you build partnerships on the field. Now, of course, I've talked already about the midfield partnership, the fact that Chiarte, Luca and McArthur have done a really good, midfield three partnership, and that's exactly what we saw from the front three as well. I thought that Ayew, Townsend and Zaha did really form a really great partnership up top, and that's the main reason I've given him a 7, is the fact that even though he didn't have much goal threat, the fact that he worked hard, the fact that he combined with the other two front three players, and just the fact that he had that energy, that's of course really great to see as well. Now, one of the reasons, you could argue the reason he didn't have much goal threat is just because he had little service, but the fact that he was still strong, he had very good movement, that matters for me. And now that's what we've got from Benteke this season, but just the fact that Ayew is just that little bit more faster and just seemed to be a little bit more effective in terms of his movement, he's a bit more agile, that obviously seemed to improve his performance. But if you're looking at Benteke and Ayew, neither of them have scored goals this season, but people would say that Ayew done better playing as a striker than Benteke has this season, whereas if I look at it, I'm like, well, actually they've both done the same thing in terms of being strong, running the channels and having movement. I just think that Jordan Ayew was just a bit more sort of nimble, let's say, a bit more quick on his feet with his movement, but ultimately, much like what the problem has been with Benteke this season, there hasn't quite been enough service to him. But overall, I do think Jordan Ayew had a very good performance, and I do think he does deserve that 7 I've given him. And like I've said already, even though he didn't have much of a goal threat, the fact that I don't think he's officially been given the assist for Zaha's goal, but I'm going to give it to him. The fact that he was involved in the build-up to Zaha's goal, as well as just after we scored, we almost scored another one. That sort of impact he's making, not necessarily scoring for himself in terms of a goal threat, but the fact that he's able to have this movement, create space for others, get others involved, that's the sort of goal threat I do like as well. So overall, a good performance from him, and obviously we don't know quite the extent of Benteke's injury, but let's say he's going to be out for a few more weeks, or even if he's back next weekend, I do certainly think based on this performance we should start with that front three, which of course includes Jordan Ayew. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the sub, and obviously we only made one sub in this game, and that is of course Jeffrey Slupp coming on for Andrews Townsend in the 90th minute. Not really going to give him a rating because he basically didn't have enough time to make an impact, but this is the thing with Roy Hodgson recently. I think especially sort of the 70th, 80th minute onwards, I was looking at the game going, we were quite tired in midfield, quite leggy, not necessarily the same intensity as we started the game, and I personally was calling for Max Meyer and maybe even Alexander Sorof to come onto the field. Ultimately, we went on to win the game, so you can't complain too much. But sometimes you've got to look at it and go, maybe Roy Hodgson's sort of ignorance in the fact that he doesn't don't want to make subs. Maybe that could be a problem for us, because when we do need to, push on and get something from the game, it would be good to make a sub. But ultimately, he's been in the football way longer than I've been watching football, so you've got to trust his instinct. But it would have been nicer for him. Obviously, he doesn't want to change the system too much, because obviously that can have a negative impact, but it would have been nice to see a few more players come off the bench, because we certainly did look a bit leggy towards the end of the game, and certainly a bit nervy in the fact that we were trying to hold on to that 1-goal lead. Now, in terms of just the 3 bullet points, overall just summing up the game, obviously we were lucky to win, because Huddersfield were by far the better team, But like I said already, it's an important win. 3 points is 3 points. Doesn't matter how we get them. And ultimately, you know, I've talked about it quite a lot this season and last season as well. We've played so well in certain games and got nothing from him. So it's quite nice once in a while, not necessarily to play great, but still get the 3 points. And like I've said already, we've played 5 games, we've got 6 points. So we're already above a point a game. And if we can carry on with that sort of thing, that sort of theme towards the end of, well, not necessarily the end of the season, but throughout the whole season, if we can carry on with that, just sort of a point a game, that of course will put us in good stead for the season. Now, to be honest, I've said already that our defending was pretty competent. Wasn't necessarily great, it was solid, but it was a bit shaky at times. And ultimately, we weren't necessarily that excellent at defending, but the main reason Huddersfield didn't score and the fact that we went on to win the game, keep the clean sheet, is just based on the fact that Huddersfield had poor finishing. So if Huddersfield could finish off a few of their chances, maybe they could have had a chance to get back into the game. But as I said with Palace this season, you know, if you get a chance, or if you create loads of chances but you don't take them, eventually you're going to be punished. And that's exactly what happened with Huddersfield. But my final bullet point, and this is a really important one, I don't want to make it seem like we are a one-man team, but Zaha will define our season. You know, we've got a player of this quality who, like he showed here against Huddersfield, he may not necessarily play great, but he can still pop up with a moment of magic. This guy, if he can stay injury-free, if he can get a little bit more protection from the referees, he's going to be a really great guy for us this season. Because if this is how good he is when he's not playing well, just imagine, like the end of last season when he's, you know, 100% playing really well. Obviously, he'll be an important player for us going forward. So I'm now going to move on to the Man of the Match award. But before I do that and give you my Man of the Match, you know, I thought had the biggest influence in the game. And now I'm going to give you the 4 nominations I put forward for the award. Now, as you've probably heard in the player ratings, you know, I've talked about it in quite a length basically, and the fact that it wasn't necessarily a great game. You know, Huddersfield were by far the better side, and obviously Palace were lucky to win. And obviously sometimes you have these games where you have to grind out a 1-0 win, or, you know, even a 2-0 win like we had there last season. Even though that performance was better, it was still quite a difficult game considering the circumstances. So like I've said already in the player ratings, not necessarily the greatest game from Palace, but obviously Huddersfield were the better side. But there were still a few good performances to pick out from that. And obviously they're the players, or the 4 players, that make up my Man of the Match shortlist for this weekend. Now, I've gone with a mixture of defenders, midfielders and attackers, because overall, even though it was a disappointing performance from Palace, there were certainly good performances across the field in different positions, in the fact that they helped us to secure the win in the end. Now, like I've said already, we basically ground out the win. You know, we didn't necessarily play great, but nevertheless, a win is a win, and obviously the 3 points are the most important thing. So obviously my 4 players are James Tomkins, Cheku Kouyaté, Wilfried Zaha and Jordan Ayew, and obviously they're on here for a number of different reasons. But obviously James Tomkins, to start with him, obviously he kept a clean sheet, which is great as well, but the fact that he's come back from injury didn't seem to affect him, you know, in the fact that he didn't necessarily look like he's just come back from injury, he didn't look sluggish. The fact that he put in such a good performance defensively and was quite important in terms of us keeping that clean sheet, whilst, you know, keeping his cool head, just being very calm at the back, and just overall, you know, winning all of his tackles and winning all of the headers in the air. The fact that he was able to do that was very impressive as well. And the main reason he's on the Man of the Match shortlist is mainly because he just proved how important he was to the side, in the fact that when he did come in, we, you know, automatically go and get a win, which just goes to show how important he is to the side. So once again, Tomkins, because of his defensive contribution in the side, and obviously the contribution he made to that clean sheet, as well as the fact that how important he was and how clear it was for us to see how he improved the team, that's why he's on the shortlist. Obviously Cheku Kouyaté, obviously he came off the bench 2 weeks ago against Southampton, played very well, obviously got the opportunity to start this game here in a midfield 3, and certainly I think he gave us that little bit of added steel which we were missing against Southampton. The main reason we lost that game is because we were being overrun in the midfield, so we're bringing Kouyaté to play alongside, you know, Luca and McArthur, and he just added that little bit extra steel. And the fact that he ran the midfield and controlled the midfield against, you know, the Huddersfield players who we know are very physical, the fact that he was able to run it, have so much stamina like he did, to carry on throughout the whole game, and obviously just sort of put pressure on the opposition, the fact that he'd done that was obviously very impressive as well. So for me, you know, the fact, even though we weren't great in the game, I still do think Cheku Kouyaté in that sort of centre of the park done a really great job in terms of, you know, not only running the midfield in terms of just controlling it, but actually going forward and getting back as well and doing his defensive work. all aspects of his game were really good, and obviously that's why he's on the man of the match shortlist. Now obviously moving on to Wilfried Zaha, obviously throughout the whole game I've talked about it quite a lot in the player ratings, but obviously he's always booed by opposition fans, and he's always moaned at by opposition players, and ultimately this sort of accumulated throughout the game. Everyone was booing him, and then what does he do? He just runs 40 yards, cuts inside, get past 3 defenders, and rifles the shot into the top corner. Absolutely fantastic goal, broke the deadlock, and once again it just highlights how important he is to the side. Just the fact that he's got that ability just to produce that moment of magic, because like I said already, it wasn't a great game, very sloppy from both sides, even though Huddersfield were better, but the fact that Zaha is able just to pop up and produce a moment of magic like that just goes to show his quality, because if you've got a player and a team who are not necessarily playing that well, it really does show the quality of a player when the fact that he can be the guy, to give you that moment of magic. So for me personally, the main reason he's on the shortlist is because of how fantastic that goal was, and obviously how good, and well, not necessarily the goal, but the build-up as well. The fact that he ran that 40 yards, got past 3 defenders, then put it top corner, that was obviously impressive as well. But also just his general sort of attacking contribution, and the fact that he didn't let the sort of booing get to him too much. Obviously he got booked for a foul, which ultimately, that's a foul, hands up. But other than that aside, other than a few niggly sort of touches and tassels here and there, or pushes with opposition players, overall he didn't really let that get to him, and that's why he's on the shortlist. And of course the final player, Jordan Ayew, obviously with Benteke out injured, he came into the side, playing up front. We were playing sort of a 4-3-3 formation. He was the lone striker, Jordan Ayew, and I thought he'd done a great job. Yes, he didn't provide us with that goal threat, but what he did provide us, and this is something we've been missing recently, is just someone who works hard up top, runs his socks off, runs down the channels, creates space, and that's exactly what he done. And the fact that he also combined well with Zaha and Townsend is obviously great as well. So not only was he attacking threat in the fact that he was working hard, creating spaces, and overall he got the assist for Zaha's goal as well, which just goes to show actually the contribution he made, but also the fact that he can link up with other players really is why he's on the shortlist for me. But it just goes to show, Benteke was injured, obviously he wasn't playing great, but if you give a player the chance, they can produce a good performance, and that's certainly what Jordan Ayew did. But like I've said already, I think these 4 players do totally deserve to be on the shortlist. Tomkins and Kouyaté for their defensive contributions, obviously Kouyaté and Ayew sort of just for the fact that they just kept running throughout the whole game, and of course Zaha for his attacking contribution and that fantastic goal he did score. But personally for me, I do think there's only one clear winner, and when you score a goal as good as that, and with the build up as having that quality as it did, I think there's only really one clear winner for me, and that is of course Wilfried Zaha. So congratulations, Wilf, you win another man of the match award this season. But it just goes to show how good your quality is, the fact that even though the team is having a bad game, the fact that you could still pop up with a fantastic goal like that just goes to show your quality. And the main reason, like I've said, the reason he's got it above players like Tomkins, Kouyaté and Ayew is just purely because of the goal, because I don't want to discredit these players too much, because like I've said, Tomkins, Kouyaté were very good defensively. Ayew and Kouyaté with their running and just their sort of tenacity throughout the game was very good as well, and of course Wilfried Zaha for the goal. So all of these players do deserve to get a bit of recognition, but I do think Zaha did stand out for me purely because of that goal, and I do think he is fully deserves the award I've given him. So now you've heard my match report, player rankings and my man of the match. That concludes this week's podcast. Now I've got interviews with Roy Hodgson, Wilfried Zaha and Jordan Ayew following the game.
Wilf, an away win today, but when will opposition fans learn that booing you makes you score?
I don't know, man. To be honest, I don't care about them really. The win's the main thing, and I'm just happy we got it.
And talk us through that goal. It was pretty special. No backlift at all.
Yeah. To be honest, I just went on a run. Then I thought, when I got inside the area, just shoot really, just. Because we never really had any proper chances before that, so I thought, let me try my luck. If you don't shoot, you don't score. So, yeah, I connected well with it, and I was happy to see it going.
Slightly different formation today. Playing up there with Jordan Ayew, was it good to play with him? He seemed to never stop running the whole game.
Yeah, he does. It helps massively because it puts them under pressure, and obviously we've got a plan. So, when he shows them the way that we want, obviously we apply the trap, and then we just counter.
How nervy was it towards the end there when they had all those chances?
Yeah, to be honest, it gets like that sometimes. You just gotta survive really, and we had a couple chances that we should have took that would have killed off the game. But the main thing is we managed to just stay in the game and win it.
And finally, how are you feeling? Obviously, you've been out injured recently, but it didn't take you long to recover.
Yeah, everyone says I've recovered like Wolverine or whatever, but yeah, I'm back. I'm happy to be back, and happy we won.
Well, we spoke to the manager, who described your performance as excellent this afternoon. How pleased were you yourself?
First of all, I'm pleased because we won today. The most important thing is the 3 points, and I've been working really hard since I've been in the team. So I'll keep on working hard. I think I had the opportunity I could have scored, but I was a bit tired and I was unlucky. This is only my second game. I think I'm in the right direction, so I have to keep on. And yeah, once again, the most important thing is that we won today, and we really did a team performance today.
How good was that goal from Wilfried Zaha?
I'm not surprised because we know how good he is, and he's a top player and he's an important player for us. So if he keeps on doing this, then we'll have a good season.
How different was your role today in the team to the last game that you played against Southampton?
Well, just the shape changed. It was 4-3-3 today, and against Southampton was 4-4-2. But I don't mind I just want to be on the pitch, and if they put me on the pitch, then I'll give my 100% for the team.
You got quite a few knocks today. It was pretty tough out there, wasn't it?
I had some few knocks, but it's the game, and you play football, and it's a men's game. So yeah, things that my position demands. So I don't have a problem with that.
Well, an away victory today. It was a tough game. Is that what you expected?
Yes, oh yeah, I think you always expect a tough game away from home, no matter who you're playing. And you come to Huddersfield, in particular, you expect one because they throw players forward, they get balls into the box, they contest everything. They've got some big, strong lads in the team. The long throws, the corner kicks. You know that your defenders and your goalkeeper are going to be put under some sort of pressure. So we expected that, but I thought we dealt with it very, very well for the best part. And you know, really, if we could have got the second goal, which I thought we were close to on several occasions, and I thought we'd actually scored it. I thought that was chalked off a little bit softly for my liking. Had we got that, I think you'd have seen us relax and cause even more problems. But having lost the last time out at home, the victory today became so important that you can't blame people for putting the result and the clean sheet before the football, which might get you a second goal.
Slight tweak to the formation today. Did it help having the international break to work on that?
Well, not really, because Wilf wasn't with us except for one day, so it didn't help a great deal. But the principles we worked on, we always work on the same principles. The tweak is not that great, to be perfectly honest, because if Wilf plays as a centre forward, as he's done alongside Benteke in the earlier parts of the season, he often drifts out to that left wing position or left side position anyway, so it didn't affect us in particular in terms of the way that we want to attack and defend, because we still had the same number of midfield players.
Jordan Ayew up front today. Were you pleased with him? He seemed to never stop running the whole game.
I thought he was excellent, really, really good. He must be delighted with his performance. I'm sure the fans, and they were great, the fans, a lot of them, and constant noise, constant support. I should think they'll be going home thinking we found a centre forward here, because that's certainly our thoughts at the moment. I thought he was really, really good.
And finally, just a word on Wilf's goal. That's the kind of thing he does, creating something out of nothing.
Yeah, he was great. I mean, the fact is to come back so quickly from that injury in itself deserves a lot of tributes. To then play the way he did, I thought he was always very, very dangerous, especially in the second half when we did break out on a few occasions. Unlucky not to score another goal. He's disappointed himself that he couldn't, but his goal itself is going to be a goal to treasure, and I'm certain we'll see lots of that on the television in the coming weeks.
So there you have it. Now you've heard what Roy Hodgson, Wilfried Zaha and Jordan Ayew had to say after the game. That concludes this week's podcast for the game against Huddersfield. But make sure to come out next week from a post-match review of the game against Newcastle. So thanks for listening, and remember to up the Palace.